April 8, 1943, outside Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. The desert air shimmered under the merciless sun as the 10th Panzer Division staggered back from the ridge, their boots sinking into hot dust, their throats raw from smoke and thirst. Mortar shells burst in the distance, throwing up clouds of ochre sand. The last thing Feldwebel Karl Brenner remembered before the ground gave way beneath him was the scream of incoming artillery and the dull whomp of an American shell striking their half-track. When he came to, his ears rang with a hollow whistle. His MG-42 lay twisted beside a burnt-out truck. The acrid stench of diesel and blood filled his nostrils. Around him, men in tattered field grey uniforms crawled from shallow craters, some with hands raised, others staring blankly into the distance. "Nicht schießen! Nicht schießen!" one shouted hoarsely. Over the ridge, shapes moved, tall silhouettes with netted helmets and olive-drab uniforms. The Americans approached in formation, rifles steady, bayonets gleaming in the afternoon glare. A sergeant barked an order. Dozens of German soldiers slowly rose, their faces a mix of exhaustion and disbelief. They had fought for the Reich across Africa, from Tobruk to El Guetar, and now they stood defeated in the sand. A young American private, sweat streaking the dust on his face, motioned toward a line of captured men. "Move it, Krauts! Hands up, no funny business." His voice carried a strange mixture of authority and pity. The prisoners complied, clutching canteens and helmets, stepping over debris and bodies that shimmered in the heat haze. By nightfall, Brenner and nearly 200 other Germans were gathered near a collection of tents under the watch of the U.S. military police. The stars over the desert flickered against a horizon, still glowing red with distant fires. In the dark, someone whispered, "They'll shoot us, you'll see." Americans take no prisoners, but the guards did not raise their weapons. They handed out tin cups and led them to a large canvas tent. Inside, a smell Brenner hadn't experienced in months. Warm bread steam rose from metal pots, coffee. Real coffee. Not the bitter barley substitute they had drunk since Stalingrad. The prisoners looked at each other in stunned silence. Could this be a trick? But when the guards poured the dark liquid into their cups and motioned for them to sit, disbelief turned into something almost childlike. The first sip burned Brenner's tongue, but it was rich, fragrant, alive. An older sergeant named Vogel muttered, "They must be trying to soften us up. No army has this much food." Yet the Americans showed no sign of cruelty or cunning. They were efficient, almost mechanical, but courteous. When one of the German soldiers collapsed from heat exhaustion, a medic knelt beside him, checked his pulse, and called for water. As the night wore on, Brenner thought of his wife, Anna, back in Hamburg, rationing potatoes and collecting bread coupons. He imagined the long lines outside bakeries, the blackout curtains drawn tight during air raids. Here, in the middle of enemy territory, he was being fed better than he had been in months. The next morning, trucks rumbled in. A convoy of olive-drab vehicles marked U.S. Army transport. The prisoners were loaded aboard, guarded but unharmed. The engines growled, and as the convoy rolled past endless dunes toward the coast, Brenner caught glimpses of American soldiers laughing, smoking, even sharing chocolate bars among themselves. The abundance was staggering. "Where do you think they're taking us?" Vogel asked. "Maybe to Algiers," Brenner said quietly. "Maybe to America." The thought seemed absurd. Prisoners of war sent across the ocean? But the Americans had the ships. They had everything. Brenner looked down at the dry sand trailing behind the truck and muttered under his breath, "If this is how they treat prisoners, what must life be like in their cities?" 2 days later, as the sun set over the port of Oran, the convoy stopped. On the docks, the prisoners saw a sight that confirmed their suspicion: a towering grey ship, its deck bristling with cranes, flags, and crew. An American transport vessel bound for the New World, and so began the journey none of them could have imagined. From the shattered deserts of North Africa to the heart of the United States, the land their propaganda had painted as decadent and weak. What they would find there would shake their belief in everything the Reich had told them. The sea smelled of oil, salt and rusted iron. For nearly 2 weeks, the prisoners crossed the Atlantic aboard the USS General Meigs, the ship groaning under the weight of thousands of German POWs captured in North Africa. The rhythmic thud of the engines echoed through the steel hull day and night. Men slept shoulder to shoulder on narrow bunks. Lulled or haunted by the endless pulse of the ocean, Feldwebel Karl Brenner sat near the ventilation grate, staring at a slice of light that bled through a seam in the bulkhead. It was hard to grasp that just a month ago he'd been fighting in the Tunisian hills. Now he was a number, POW 2029-1, under the custody of men who didn't seem to hate him. The guards on deck were young, mostly farm boys from Iowa or Kansas, armed with M1 Garans and an easy confidence that came from knowing the war was far away from their homes. One of them, Private Jack Wilson, stood near the railing during every meal, chewing gum and humming Benny Goodman tunes. "You guys'll be fine," he said one evening when a few of the Germans hesitated before taking their rations. "Camp's clean, food's hot. You'll eat better than we do in the field." The words sounded almost like a joke. But when the prisoners opened their mess tins, they found thick stew, chunks of beef, potatoes, and carrots swimming in gravy. There was even soft bread, slightly sweet, and a small yellow fruit most of them hadn't seen since before the war, a banana. The men stared at it as though it were gold. Some held it up, inspecting the smooth peel with reverence. A few didn't even know how to open it properly, slicing it with their pocket knives like sausage. The smell filled the hold, sweet, foreign, intoxicating. Vogel laughed, shaking his head. "In Berlin, my wife waits in line 4 hours for turnips. Here they give prisoners bananas." For the Americans, it was nothing unusual. Bananas, coffee, white bread, it was simply part of their diet. But for the Germans, whose homeland had been rationed into near starvation, this abundance bordered on the unbelievable. At night, as the ship rolled through waves beneath a sky alive with stars, Brenner and Vogel lay awake, whispering. "They told us America was collapsing," Brenner said quietly. "That their factories couldn't keep up, that their people were soft." Vogel exhaled, staring into the dark. "If this is collapse, I wonder what victory looks like." The voyage was long but uneventful. Occasionally destroyers would appear on the horizon, black silhouettes escorting the convoy through submarine-infested waters. When the klaxons sounded for drills, everyone, Americans and Germans alike, rushed to their stations. Brenner was impressed by their discipline, their calm efficiency. No shouting, no panic, just practiced coordination. On the 11th morning, a distant cry from the deck shattered the monotony. "Land ho!" The prisoners surged toward the portholes. Through the mist, they saw a line of green hills and smokestacks rising from the horizon, New York Harbor. As the General Meigs glided past the Statue of Liberty, the Germans fell silent. Even those who despised America couldn't help but stare. The statue's torch gleamed against the morning sky, symbolizing everything they had been told to fear: wealth, freedom, excess. They were herded ashore under watchful eyes, processed by MPs, and loaded onto trains bound for the interior. The journey stretched for days, the landscape shifting from cities to rolling fields to quiet rural towns. Every station brought a new shock: well-fed civilians, smiling children, shop windows brimming with goods. One prisoner muttered, "If this is what war looks like here, we've already lost." Eventually, their train slowed before a fenced compound surrounded by pine trees and barbed wire. A sign read, "Camp Concordia, Kansas." The prisoners stepped off into crisp morning air, expecting the usual bleak barracks and punishment drills. Instead, they found something else entirely: neat wooden huts, laundry lines, even a baseball field. When an American sergeant opened the mess hall doors, the smell hit them first: fresh bread, roasted meat, and that unmistakable scent of coffee. Real coffee. Brenner froze at the doorway. Vogel whispered beside him, half in awe, half in confusion, "We are prisoners, and yet we live better than our families at home." Inside, rows of tables were lined with trays of food: beans, potatoes, butter, and something no German POW could have predicted: fruit, apples, oranges, bananas. A murmur rippled through the ranks. Some men crossed themselves. Others just stared. As the line moved forward, an American cook with rolled-up sleeves grinned. "Welcome to Kansas, fellas. Hope you're hungry." For the first time since the war began, Karl Brenner smiled. He didn't understand this country, or how it could afford such plenty, but he knew one thing: everything he had been told about America was a lie. Camp Concordia stretched across the plains like a small town enclosed in barbed wire. From the watchtowers, the Kansas landscape rolled away endlessly. fields of wheat and distant water towers shimmering in the heat. For the captured Germans, it was a strange sight. No bombed cities, no sirens, no hunger. Just quiet order. The camp itself housed more than 4,000 POWs, mostly from the Afrika Korps and the Luftwaffe. Each morning began with the clang of a bell and the bark of roll call, but even that seemed civilized. The American guards treated the prisoners with a professionalism none of them expected. They weren't beaten, humiliated, or starved. They were counted, fed, and, most bewildering of all, trusted with work details. Feldwebel Karl Brenner soon found himself assigned to the camp's farm unit. Under guard, the men were marched to nearby fields owned by local Kansas farmers. There they harvested wheat, repaired fences, and even milked cows. The farmers, desperate for labor with so many young Americans fighting overseas, often greeted them with nods and cautious smiles. One morning, as Brenner hauled sacks of feed from a barn, the farmer's wife appeared on the porch with a tray of something steaming. "Coffee?" she asked in hesitant English. Brenner blinked. "Für uns?" he asked. She nodded. The men sat beneath the shade of a windmill, drinking from enamel mugs and tasting a kind of warmth that had nothing to do with the Kansas sun. The farmer's wife offered them slices of bread spread with something golden. "Honey, real honey. America must be made of gold," Vogel whispered. "Even their farmers live like kings. Everywhere they looked, there was food. Meat, milk, eggs, none of the substitutes or ration cards that defined life in Germany. And the Americans didn't gloat. They simply shared it as though plenty were a fact of nature. Back in the barracks, evenings were spent in quiet conversation. The camp commandant, a fair-minded officer named Captain Harold Stone, encouraged the POWs to form study groups and attend lectures. There were English lessons, carpentry workshops, even a small orchestra. A U.S. Army librarian distributed donated books, Shakespeare, Steinbeck, Goethe, and prisoners read by lantern light long after curfew. Some nights, the smell of roasting meat drifted through the camp as the cooks prepared dinner. The menu rotated between beef stew, mashed potatoes, corn, and fruit. Always fruit, and always coffee. Hot, black, plentiful. For men who had eaten boiled cabbage and moldy bread in the final days of the Africa campaign, it felt surreal. "They feed us like allies," one prisoner murmured, shaking his head. Of course, not everyone was at ease. The die-hard Nazis, men still loyal to the Reich, warned that this generosity was propaganda, an attempt to corrupt their loyalty. They held secret meetings in the barracks, whispering that the Americans were softening them for interrogation, but the longer the months dragged on, the harder it became to believe that. The guards never threatened them. The work was manageable. Even the punishments were mild. Brenner often found himself thinking of Anna back in Hamburg, of her waiting in long bread lines while bombs fell overhead. He imagined writing to her, describing the fresh coffee and the bananas, that arrived by the crate every week. But how could he explain it without sounding insane? The censors would never let such letters through anyway. One evening, as he sat outside the barracks, an American MP named Wilson, the same one from the ship, approached. "Evening, Sergeant," he said, smiling. "You settling in all right?" Brenner hesitated, then nodded. "You treat us better than I expected." Wilson shrugged. "We figure the war'll end someday. Might as well start acting like men now." The simplicity of that answer struck Brenner more than any propaganda speech ever could. Weeks turned into months. The prisoners worked, read, and played soccer in the open yard. Winter came early that year, covering the plains in snow. When Christmas arrived, the camp chaplain allowed the Germans to hold a small midnight service. They sang Stille Nacht, their voices rising through the cold air, and to their astonishment some of the American guards joined in. The melody, soft, universal, floated past the watchtowers and out across the Kansas night. Afterward, the mess hall served roast turkey, potatoes, and fruit pie. Pie. Brenner stared at his plate in disbelief. In that moment, he realized how profoundly the war had distorted their sense of normal life. Here, inside barbed wire, he felt safer and more human than he had in years. The irony was bitter and beautiful all at once. As 1944 approached, rumors of the war's shifting tides reached even the heart of Kansas. The Allies had landed in Italy. The Luftwaffe was crumbling. And still the food came: bananas, coffee, meat. Every day seemed to mock the propaganda that had once promised Germany's supremacy. When the guard served breakfast one cold January morning, a new shipment had arrived. Boxes of oranges from Florida. The bright fruit glowed against the snow, and the men laughed as they peeled them, the air filling with citrus. For Karl Brenner, that smell, the sweet, clean scent of an orange in winter, became the smell of awakening. He had begun this journey as a soldier of the Reich. Now, he was something else entirely, a man learning that mercy could exist even in the heart of war. Spring 1944 came with a gentle breeze that swept across the plains, carrying the scent of tilled soil and rain. The barbed wire glistened under the Kansas sun, but inside Camp Concordia, life had settled into an odd rhythm, a routine that almost felt peaceful. The Germans planted flowers outside their barracks, built benches, even painted murals on the walls depicting Alpine mountains and Bavarian villages. The Americans didn't stop them. In fact, they encouraged it. "Keeps morale up," Captain Stone said with a shrug. To Feldwebel Karl Brenner, it felt like living in two worlds at once, one bounded by fences and guard towers, the other rich with the illusion of normalcy. In the mornings, he joined work crews at a nearby grain silo, helping load train cars bound for the coast. The farmers' wives sometimes brought sandwiches and coffee, always coffee, and chatted through the fence as if the Germans were distant cousins rather than prisoners of war. One day, a teenage boy from town approached with a brown paper bag and tossed it over the fence. Inside were fresh apples and a note scrawled in shaky handwriting. From one farm boy to another, "My dad says you work hard. Stay strong." Brenner folded the note carefully into his jacket pocket. He didn't know why, but the gesture touched him more deeply than any victory medal he'd ever earned. That evening, he shared the apples with Vogel and a few others, the sweet crunch echoing in the quiet barracks. "If the Führer could see this," Vogel joked, "he'd ban fruit as subversive." The others laughed softly, but beneath the humor was a weight they all felt. The Reich had told them America was decadent, lazy, corrupt. Yet here they were, prisoners, being treated with decency and fed like free men. News from home arrived sporadically through Red Cross bulletins. Hamburg, Dresden, Berlin, all were being bombed relentlessly. Brenner's thoughts often drifted to Anna, wondering if she was still alive, still waiting. He imagined her thin, pale face lighting up at the thought of fresh bread or a warm cup of coffee. The contrast between his full stomach and her hunger gnawed at him. "Sometimes," he said one night, staring at the camp fence, "I feel ashamed to eat." Vogel nodded slowly. "Me too, but maybe this is what peace looks like. A world where men don't have to starve to prove they're strong." In the summer, the camp organized a cultural exhibition. German POWs displayed wood carvings, paintings, and even a small orchestra concert performed in the recreation hall. American officers, local townsfolk, and a few journalists attended. The event was strange and surreal. Enemy soldiers applauded by American civilians. But for one evening, the war felt far away. After the concert, an American journalist interviewed Brenner, asking, "What surprises you most about life here?" Brenner hesitated before answering. "The kindness," he said. "And the coffee," he smiled faintly. "You have more coffee in one day than my family saw in 2 years," the reporter chuckled, jotting down notes. "Guess we'll call that American hospitality." By autumn, the POWs began to notice something shifting in their own hearts. The ideological fervor that once defined them had faded. The daily rituals of plenty, the meals, the small acts of respect, had quietly eroded the lies they'd grown up with. They began writing letters not about glory but about hope, about the future. For some, the idea of returning home to a ruined Germany filled them with dread. What would they find? What would they believe in? Then came June 1944. The Americans woke them before dawn. From the mess hall radio came the broadcast. Eisenhower's voice announcing the Allied landings in Normandy, France. The invasion had begun. The camp fell into uneasy silence. Some cheered quietly, others stared at their plates, realizing that the war was slipping away from them for good. Weeks passed. Victory for the Allies seemed inevitable. Yet despite being the enemy, the Germans were still given their bananas, their oranges, their endless coffee. It was as if America wanted to prove with every meal that its strength came not from fear or hatred, but from generosity. Late that summer, Brenner sat by the fence watching the sunset burn gold over the prairie. Wilson, the American guard, strolled over, leaning on his rifle. "War's about done, Carl," he said softly. "You'll be heading home soon." "Home," Brenner repeated, tasting the word like something foreign. "If it still exists," Wilson nodded slowly. "Maybe you'll help rebuild it. Someone's got to." For a long moment, neither man spoke. The air smelled faintly of roasted corn and diesel fuel. A freight train rumbled in the distance. Somewhere an American radio played Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade. Brenner finally said, "When I first saw your coffee, I thought it was a trick. Now I think maybe it was a lesson." Wilson smiled. "Funny thing, coffee. Doesn't seem important till you run out of it." The next morning, a new shipment arrived at the camp, a crate marked Dole. Inside were bunches of ripe bananas, the bright yellow skins glowing under the morning sun. Brenner took one, peeled it slowly, and took a bite. It was sweet, smooth, and absurdly alive. In that small, ordinary act, he realized something profound. The war had taken everything from him except the capacity to feel wonder. And in this place, this strange, generous prison, he had rediscovered it. Months later, when the war finally ended, the Germans lined up to be processed for repatriation. Some wept openly. Others saluted the American officers before boarding the trains east. As Brenner stepped through the gate for the last time, he turned back once more to see the camp, the watchtowers, the flags, the mess hall chimney puffing out the faint aroma of morning coffee. He smiled, not out of joy but gratitude. Gratitude that even in captivity, he had learned the meaning of freedom.